Hey everyone, and welcome back to the MERN Stack Crash Course. In this episode, we're going to take care of storing media like images and video in our database. Up until this point, every piece of data that has entered our database has been in the form of a JSON object, where each object basically just contains properties that give us useful information about a user or about a blog post. However, there's a big thing that our app is missing right now. This right here is all just text. What if you wanted to store different forms of media, like images, videos, or audio files? Right now, we don't have any functionality to do that since we're just storing what is essentially just text. If we just go to a sample blog website, let's say NASA for example, we can click on any one of these blogs here. You'll notice how in each one of these blogs, there's always an image at the top. So this one has an image on it. I can go down to here. There's an image on this one as well in the blog information. I can go down here. There's also an image on this one. And in general, it's extremely common for each blog post, no matter what blog platform you're on, to have some sort of cover image or some type of title image like this one. Because of that, we should add functionality for our database to store images at the very least. MongoDB is great for storing documents and text data, but that's really all it can store. If you want to store images, there's a way to do it with MongoDB, but it's not recommended because Mongo isn't really made for media storage. We should use some other tool that we can connect to our app. There's a handful of different tools you could use for media storage, but the one I've used in the past is AWS S3. It's AWS's, meaning Amazon's, primary storage tool, and it's honestly pretty simple and easy to get set up. So before we get into any code using AWS, you want to make sure you have an AWS account set up. If you go to aws.amazon.com right here, you should be on some page that looks at least something like this, and then you want to go to the sign in here to the console. And this is kind of the root login page. If you don't have an account yet with AWS, go ahead and make a free account. I already have an account, so I'm not going to walk through the exact process to go ahead and set it up, but go ahead and set it up and make sure you choose the free tier because you shouldn't have to pay anything to get this account made. Once you sign in, it should take you to your AWS dashboard, which would look something like this. This dashboard has access to all of the AWS tools, which there are tons and tons of. We're not worried about other AWS features for right now. We just want S3 for storage. To find S3, go up here to Services, and at the bottom there should be the Storage tab. Go ahead and click on that. And right here you'll see this says S3. Go ahead and click on this link here. And what's nice is that once you visited S3, it'll say recent when you go back to your dashboard, so you can just go click on it without having to search through this services menu. AWS S3 stores media in what we call buckets. Buckets are pretty much the equivalent of collections in Mongo. Just like a Mongo collection can have multiple items in it, an S3 bucket can have multiple images, videos, or whatever else. As you can see, I already have one bucket here called Mongo Development, which was some previous project I work on. If you want to make a new bucket, go over to this button here, it says Create Bucket, and click on it. First off, it should be in the same region that you made your account with. In my case, it is US East, which is US East 2. And then for the bucket name, I'm just going to name this something super simple for right now. I'm just going to call it Blog Storage. Actually, I'll go ahead and zoom this in so you guys can see a little better. And then let's scroll down, look at the rest of this customization here. We're going to block public access. We're going to keep this disabled. Tags I don't care about. Encryption, we'll just keep this type as the default. And we'll enable the key as well. We don't need any of these advanced settings. Let's just go ahead and click Create Bucket. And it looks like there was a problem. Bucket name must not contain uppercase letters. Let me do blog underscore. Actually, that's not going to work either. I'll do blog storage just like this. Bucket with the same name already exists. Okay, it's being a little annoying here. Let me just add full stack blog storage, see if that works. We'll go down to the bottom. Go ahead and click Create Bucket. And this time it looks like it created. So now we have this new bucket here, full stack blog storage, which again, like I said, is just like a collection in Mongo. Once you have this bucket created, you can click it and see inside the bucket. Obviously right now there's nothing in here since we haven't added anything yet. Just like with MongoDB, we can manually upload stuff if we want. For example, I could click this upload button right here and manually upload an image into our bucket. Obviously though, we want to be able to upload images and whatnot through our app, not manually. Now that we have this AWS bucket set up, let's get our uploading set up in our code. The first thing we want to do is in our terminal, install the software development kit for AWS, which we can do with one line with npm. So if we go into our terminal here, let's make sure we're looking in our backend folder. Then I'm going to write this line, npm install @ AWS SDK, which stands for Software Development Kit, and it uses a library called client-s3. Go ahead and press enter here, and it should install this library. And again, AWS SDK means AWS Software Development Kit, and we're specifically installing the kit for the S3 client, which will allow us to interact with our S3 database that we just made. And once we've done this, I actually want to go and create a new file to handle all of our AWS logic. So right now, if we go ahead and look in our backend, I'm going to close out of all this stuff here, get all this out of the way. If we look on our backend, we obviously have our post routes file for every time we're interacting with the post from Mongo, and we have the user routes file for any time we're interacting with the users in Mongo. But I want to make a similar thing for any time we're interacting with the AWS stuff. Because again, AWS is kind of like its own collection in the form of buckets. So I'm going to make a separate file, and I'm going to call it AWS Routes.js. Just to avoid us having to rewrite a bunch of code, I'm going to go into post routes here. I'm going to go ahead and Control A this to select all of it, kind of copy it, and I'm going to paste it all into here. And we're going to delete a lot of this, but I just wanted to not reuse all this code. So I'm going to go ahead and just rename post routes to AWS routes using the Control F. So anywhere where we see post routes, we're going to change that to AWS routes. Go ahead and replace all. And then let's just change some of these around. So I know I'm not going to be using the route to get all of our AWS images all at once. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete this. We're going to keep the retrieve one, create one, update one, and delete one. And we're going to keep this verified token that we wrote last time, just so we can keep our authorization part intact. I'm going to go ahead and just renumber these. This should be 2, 3, and this should be 4. For this file, we're also going to need a couple of essential functions from AWS to make sure this works. There's pretty much a function for each action, like uploading, retrieving, and deleting, and there's also one for initializing the client. So we can import the library that we just installed by going up here, and let's say, I'm actually going to destructure the imports. So I'm going to write S3 client is the first one. We have one called put object command, which creates an object, one called get object command, which gets an object, and one called delete object command, which again, obviously just deletes an object. And to import them from the library, we can say equals require, and it'll be from exactly what we just installed. So AWS SDK / client -S3. And again, just so we're clear, this S3 client initializes the client, put object command creates an object in our bucket, get object gets an object from our bucket, and delete object deletes an object from our bucket. So actually, because we only have these three, we don't want to have to worry about editing images. So I'm actually going to just delete this one here, this update route. And let's just say this third route is to delete. So all we're going to have is the functionality to get a single image, to create a single image, and to delete a single image. Now that we know what functions we're going to need, these imported ones here, we can go ahead and start working on our routes. All of our previous routes that we've had have interacted exclusively with MongoDB. But now we want to work with AWS, so we need to change this functionality around a little bit. With MongoDB, we have functions to get the database and connect to the database, and we're going to need to do something similar with AWS. And for all of our routes here, instead of saying post, I'm going to change these to all to just say images instead. So say images, and then images here. Let me go ahead and zoom this in one more time so it's a little easier for you to see. Now, to connect to our AWS database, we can use the S3 client function that we just mentioned. To do it, all we need to write is const. I'll make a variable. I'm going to call this S3 client and set it equal to new AWS, actually new S3 client like this. And this will call this function that we just imported from up here. Inside of this S3 client here, we want to pass in an object that has the configuration settings for S3. So we'll go ahead and write curly brackets. And for this, there's two fields that we need to fill out. The first one should be the region. And in my case, I was in US East 2. So I'll put that as a string. It should be US-East-2. So I'm filling that out for my region string. The next field we want to focus on is called credentials. And this will actually be an object. And this credentials object is here to verify that we're actually a valid user trying to get into the client. We're going to need two things in this object. We're going to need one called access key ID, and then we're going to need another one called secret access key like this. We don't have those two things yet, so I'll show you exactly how to get them. AWS uses a service called IAM to authenticate users. So if we actually go back to our AWS page here and we go to our services, go ahead and search for IAM, spelled like this, and you should see this IAM pop up right here. Go ahead and click it, and then go to the IAM page. Next, go ahead and go over to the users tab. then you're going to want to create a new user. I would probably name it something relating to the app. So I'm going to go ahead and go here. I'm going to name this, let's just say blog app like this. And then I'm going to go ahead and click next. And it'll say add to group. No, we're just going to go ahead and not attach it to anything. Go here. And then we'll go ahead and click create user. And we have just now created a blog app user. Once you've created that user, go ahead and click on it in here. And then once you do that, go over to this tab called Security Credentials. Over here on the right-hand side where it says access keys, you should see something that says create access key. Go ahead and click it, and it should take you to a menu that looks something like this. And it asks you what you want to use the key for. We're using it for application code running on our own local machine. So I'm going to go ahead and select local code. Go ahead and check this box and go ahead and press next. It'll ask you for a description tag. And for this, I'll just say used to connect blog app to AWS S3. And then I'm going to go ahead and click create access key. And this will generate your access key as well as your secret access key. I would definitely download the CSV file if I were you to keep track of your access key and your secret access key. Or at the very least, just go ahead and copy this here, paste it, and then write it down somewhere. You can always come back to this page to look at what your access key is, but you can actually never come back to see what your secret key is. Once you click off this page, you're never going to be able to find it again, so make sure you have it downloaded. Or, like I said, at least copied, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this, so it's copied to my keyboard, and then we can go ahead and press done. In our app, just like we're doing with our secret key for our JSON tokens, and like we're doing for Mongo, I actually want to store these in our environmental variables. So I'm going to go into config.env here, and I'm going to add two more things. I'm going to add AWS secret key, and I'm also going to add AWS access key. I'll set my secret key equal to this. I'll paste it in. I will go back to my access key here. Let's go back to my credentials. Go ahead and copy this access key, and we'll go ahead and paste it in too. So now we have our secret key and we have our access key. Go ahead and save this file. And now that we have those two things, we can go ahead and fill in these two fields. So since we're using environment variables for this one, we can just do should not be uppercase, process.env. And we named this one, it was AWS access key. And then on bottom here for the secret access key, it's the same thing, process.env.aws secret key. Once we have this region in our client, as well as the credentials, we're all configured to interact with AWS S3 in our code. One last thing I'm going to add up here just to help us out is just an alias for the name of our bucket. So I'm going to say const S3 bucket. And I believe, let me just go up here and make sure I have the right name. Let's go back to S3. And the name of it was, full stack blog storage. So I'll make a variable for that. We're just going to say full stack blog storage. Now that we have that, let's focus on making our three routes. And we know our three are going to be retrieving an image, creating an image, and deleting an image. So let's first start with retrieving an image. Let's actually first start with the route to go ahead and create an image. So we'll start with this route right here. Let's start fresh in this route. So I'm going to go ahead and delete all this stuff because we won't be needing anything relating to Mongo. Whenever we create an object like this, just like we did with our post routes and our user routes, we're going to store the object itself that we're uploading in the request body. So just so we can make it easier for ourselves, I'm going to make a variable for that. I'm going to say const file equals request.body. And this file will represent the actual image file that we're going to be uploading to AWS, which we'll be passing in from our front end. To create an object in AWS and put it into a bucket, we need to invoke this put object command here that we imported from earlier, and is taken again directly from the AWS software development kit. However, we first need to give it some parameters to know which bucket it is accessing, and to know what it should name the file. We need to make an object, which I just like to call, I'll just call it bucket params, equals, and it will contain three important things. Number one is going to be the name of the bucket we want to access. So I'm going to go ahead and name this field bucket, and its corresponding value is going to be the name of our actual bucket, which is stored right here. That's an S3 bucket. So we're going to say our name is S3 bucket, just like this. Number two is a key field, and this is what the file is going to be named in AWS. We assume our object is going to be a file, so let's make the key equal to file.name from this variable right here, which again is just our actual image file. Lastly, number three, we need the actual content, meaning the image itself, so that AWS knows what it is that it's actually uploading. we need to call this field body, and its corresponding value is just going to be file. Now, all we need to do once we have this is invoke the put object command function. We'll also make a variable to capture the result of this call. To do that, I'm just going to say const data equals, and before we call the put object command, we need to actually put it inside another function, and that's going to be await S3 client.send. So basically, anytime we want to run any of these commands up here, like put object command, get object command, or delete object command, we need to run this line first, S3 client.send, and then inside of here is where we can put the command that we actually want to send. We need to say new because we're technically calling a constructor, and then put, if I can spell it right, put object command, just like this. And then inside of these parentheses, we'll just pass in the bucket params object that we just made, which has everything we need to know in order to upload our file. And then we're still just returning the data to a response through this response.json data. What we've just done now is created functionality in the backend to upload a whole file to AWS, namely an image. Obviously, we'll still need to take care of file submission in the front end, but the backend is looking good so far. Next, let's work on retrieving a file from AWS. So we're going to work on this route right here. I'm going to go ahead and wipe all of this out here. It's actually very similar to this route. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to paste it in here. And let's just still make sure this should be a get method, not a post method. So we're good on that front. The only thing is, whenever we are getting an image from AWS, we're not going to be passing in a file down to this request body here. Instead, we're just passing an ID for our parameters, which is going to be stored. We'll say const ID, and that's stored in request.params.id. And in this route, we'll also need this bucket params object that basically just tells AWS what exactly it is that we're looking for. The only difference is, we actually don't need this body field because we're not uploading anything. And this key field needs to change to just match the ID of whatever image it is that we're trying to receive, which is stored in this variable here. And the very last thing we need to go ahead and do is instead of put object command, we're just going to change 3 letters and make this get object command so it matches this function that we're importing right here. Assuming this line runs successfully, what this will do is look at the bucket that we specified, and then it will look at the key that we gave it, and it will try to find an image that matches a key that is in this bucket, which means the result of this will be an image, and that will get stored in this data variable, which we are just writing back to our front end. One thing we should note though is that when AWS returns a file with this get object command right here, it returns it as a readable stream, not an actual image, meaning it's not readily available to display on our front end, which is a bit inconvenient for the client. The 2 ways I've typically handled this in the past are using blobs or base64 strings, both of which will allow us to return something a bit more convenient to the front end. For our purpose, we're just going to use a base64 string to return this data back. Base64 strings are nice for images because we can use them as image sources. Before we return anything, we actually want to write 2 lines down here. The first one should be getting the file type or content type of the data that we just grabbed from S3. So we'll just say const content type. I'll set it equal to data.content type like this. And actually the C should be capitalized, so it's just like this. This will let us know whether it's an image, video, or whatever else, and it's going to be used when we're returning our image string. The next thing we need to do is actually convert the data here to base64, which is fairly simple. All we need to do is go ahead and down here, create a new variable. I'm going to call it source string, set it equal to data.body.transform to string, and then we're going to specify base64. And this is technically for some reason asynchronous, so I'm going to go ahead and add the await keyword in front of this. All that this line here is technically doing is taking the body of our response data here, and then it is calling this method transform to string to turn it into a base64 string, and then storing it in this source string variable. Lastly, we just need to return something. When we're returning a base64 string as an image source, we need to do it in a certain format, and that's the reason we got these 2 variables right here. We'll just go ahead and write down here at the bottom, let's make a variable for it. It will be const, I'm going to say image source equals, I'm going to do a backtick character so I can inject JavaScript. And then what I'm going to do is say data, and we're going to inject JavaScript here, and that's going to be content type, and then semicolon to separate out the properties. And then we're going to say base64. We're going to do colon right here, another thing here, and say source string. And actually, wait, this should not be a colon. This should be, I believe, a comma. I know this stuff here probably looks a little weird and might not make much sense to you, But this is just the standard convention for using base 64 strings in JSX as image sources. Now that we've specified it in this format, we can directly use this string as an image source in our JSX. So if I were to plug this into an image tag, it would actually display the image that we just pulled from S3. So lastly, let's just go ahead and write the body of our response to our response header here. So instead of saying data, we're just going to pass in image source, and that will return our image to the front end as a base 64 string. Great, so now we have the route to create an image in AWS and also to get an image from AWS. And I actually changed my mind. I'm going to go ahead and ignore this delete for now, because for right now, I don't want to actually mess with deleting stuff from AWS. So we're just going to keep it to creating something and getting something for right now, just to keep it simple. Keep in mind that we still have for both of these routes this verify token function, because for these routes, we still want to make sure that the user is verified with their token in the front end. So we're just keeping this in each one of these routes here. So this means that we've got this file all taken care of. So I'm going to go ahead and save this file, and I'm going to go ahead and try and mount our routes now. And next, just like our user routes and our post routes, we have to mount them using Express first. So let's go ahead and go to our folder here. Let's go to the server file, and let's go ahead and import the AWS routes. So I'm going to say const AWS routes equals require, and that should just be in the file AWS routes. And then down here, all we'll say is app.use AWS routes like this. This will make sure that our backend is able to now see those routes. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And just for good measure, I'm going to go ahead and restart our server just to make sure it updates. So I go ahead and close this out here. Go ahead and start the server. And now that is back up and running. Let's now get started in the front end with this. So we're going to go ahead and move to the API file that we have in our front end. And this contains, again, all the functions that we use to call all of our backend routes. So I'm actually going to add a function for each one of the routes that we made. So I'm going to make one function down here. I'm going to call it export async function. Let's go down a little bit. And I'm just going to name this create image. And then I'll also do one for getting an image. I'll say export async function get image. And these will be our two functions that call the two backend routes that we just made respectively. For these two functions, we will assume that create image needs a file argument that will represent the actual file that we're uploading to AWS. And get image will need an ID, so we know what ID of the image that we're getting. To create an image, let's go ahead and take one of the post routes that we already have. I'm just going to take this right here, and I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste it into here. And let's just change this around a little bit. If we go back to the AWS routes, we can recall that to go ahead and create an image, the path is /images. So let's go ahead and go into here, make sure this is post, which it is. And then we just want to switch this to /images. And then instead of passing in any sort of user, we're going to pass in the file that we're getting from the front end. So we're going to pass in file right here. But wait, before we go any farther, we need to change one more thing. By default, you can't just pass in a file through Axios. We need to convert it to form data first so that the backend can recognize it. To do that, let's just go up here and let's write const form data equals, and we're going to construct a new form data object. And then what we're going to do is just call form data.append, and we're going to add our file. We're going to give it a field called image, and here we can add our file object. This will make sure that our file gets sent as form data rather than a raw file. This should be comma, not a colon. And this will make sure that our backend can read it properly. So, and then instead of passing in the file, let's now pass in our form data instead through Axios. And then the last thing we want to do here is go ahead and give it a custom header. So we're going to say headers like this, and this will be an object. And this is where we can tell it what content type to expect. So we'll say content type, and this will be equal to multipart / form data. And then at the very bottom, we'll just go ahead and now return response. And because we made a couple of changes to this using form data instead of a raw image, we'll need to make a couple of slight modifications in the backend real quickly. There's a library that I like to use that makes handling files in the backend really easily. And it's a library called Multer. To go ahead and install it, I'm going to go into my terminal here. I'm going to go to our backend, and I'm just going to run npm install Multer. What Multer does is handles a lot of the file functionality for us when it comes to managing it in the backend. To go ahead and add this to our project, we'll just go ahead and go into our server here. And then let's just go ahead and at the top here, we're going to add const Multer, and we're going to import it. We're going to say require, and that will just be Multer. And then to initialize this, we can just say const upload equals Multer and just call that. And then the very last thing we need to do is just mount it like we would all these other routes. Before we actually mount these routes, we're going to say app.use, and we'll call upload.any. So what this Multer library does is allow us to send files to the backend using form data. And these couple of lines of code that we just wrote in here are simply initializing it. The only other change we'll need to make is in our AWS Routes file. Let's go ahead and save this and navigate over there. Now, right here where we're capturing our file, instead of saying request.body, thanks to Multer, we can use something called request.files. This is part of what Multer does. It automatically adds a files field to your request so you can access it like this in the event that you have sent a file. To capture the specific file that we're looking for, we'll need to access the 0 index, meaning the first file, because it treats it as an array and there could be multiple files in here. But once we go ahead and save this, we've now taken those steps, and now we can move on to getting an image. Getting an image is a lot easier. All we need to do is just capture the response here, and we're just going to call a simple Axios get. We know we're just going to be doing our base URL. Oops, not base URL, should just be URL. And then we want to have /images, and then we need to pass in this ID right here as part of this path. So we're just going to do this and pass in the ID. That way, this request is matching the format that we specified right here in the backend. And just so I don't forget, we'll make sure to add the await keyword in front of the request. And then last thing we'll do is go ahead and return the response. Now we should be all good to go in this file. Before we go any farther, there's one thing we need to think about practically when we're trying to get an image, so we're wanting to use this function here. For getting an image, we need its ID, but where are we getting this ID from? For example, if I want to display a blog post that has a header image, where am I supposed to get the image ID from so I can query AWS for the actual image itself? Well, here's probably the easiest way that we can do that. If we go ahead and head over to Mongo, we know that we're already storing all the essential stuff for each post, like title, description, and content, etc. And we also know there's going to be one header image per post. Therefore, what we could do is just add an image ID field here in Mongo that would store the ID that corresponds to the image in AWS. If this doesn't make sense yet, I think it will in just a moment. Let's first head into our postroutes.js file. I'm going to save this first. Let's go into postroutes.js and let's go down to where we are creating a post. And we're going to add another field here and we're going to call it image ID. I'm going to say image ID. And then we're going to assume that in request.body, there will be another field called image ID. So we're going to say request.body.image ID. We're going to go ahead and copy this, scroll down, and we'll want to add this here for the update as well. So for all new posts and anytime we update a post, we're going to be adding an image ID field. This will be how we know what ID to query from AWS. Now that we have an image ID field in Mongo, let's think about how we need to rework the code for when we upload a blog post to Mongo. So let's go ahead and go here where we are creating a post. We need to do two things now. First, we need to upload the chosen image to AWS, which will return to us the ID of that image. And then second, we will then upload our post object to Mongo right here, just like we're doing before with the new image ID attached. So I'm going to go ahead and make some space right here. And what we're actually going to want to do is we're going to want to call the function we just made to create an image first. So let's go down here. We see this file is called create image and we need to pass in, the function is called create image and we need to pass in one file argument. So let's go back up here. Let's go ahead and add another Axios request. So we're going to go ahead and add a call to that function. So we're going to call create image. And then now we need to pass in a file here. I'm going to go ahead and add the await because this is asynchronous. Whenever we capture the image from our React code, I'm going to assume we're going to store it in a property called file. So I'm going to say post.file. And what this line of code will do is call this create image function down here. And we'll actually upload the image to AWS in the bucket that we chose. And if we go back to our AWS routes here, where we go back to where we're creating a file here, we know that we're getting this response whenever we are uploading the object to the bucket, and we're just returning that as JSON data. If we navigate to the AWS SDK documentation, we can see what the response actually looks like whenever we use this put object command in conjunction with send. And if you can see it, it is this right here. It is an object with an e-tag field as well as a version ID field. Now, I believe this version ID field is the actual ID of the file that we just uploaded. So in that case, since it's stored in something called version ID, what we can do is go back into our code here. We can navigate back into our API file, and then we can capture the ID of the newly uploaded image by just saying, we can do variables, say const image ID equals data.version ID. And actually, give me just 1 second. Whenever we create a image, it's going to return it in an HTTP response, which means that that's going to be in our data field as well. So it's actually going to be two nested data. So it should be data.data.version ID. I believe this is correct, but we can change it later if we need to. Now what we should do is go ahead and add this image ID to the post that we're sending to Mongo to ensure it gets added to Mongo correctly. So let's go down here, and then I'm just going to go ahead and add field on our post object. So I'm going to say post.imageID equals image ID. That way, whenever we're passing it down to our post where we're actually creating it in Mongo, we're also adding the image ID to it. Now this is done, let's go ahead and change how we are also getting a post as well, because now we'll need to include getting the image from Mongo and AWS. So this is done. Let's go ahead and go up here to get post. And we're going to do a very similar thing in this function. We're going to say const data equals await, and we're going to call the get image function. But wait, whenever we're calling get image, remember that we need to pass in an ID here. And that ID needs to be the ID of the image that we're getting from AWS. And that ID is stored in Mongo. So we actually need to call this after we call this here. So let's make space up here. And this response is going to represent the post that we got back from Mongo, meaning that ID would be stored in response.data, because it's always stored in data field, and then in ID. Actually, no, sorry, it would not be ID, it would be image ID. We know that the information for the post is going to be stored in response.data. So let's go ahead and make a variable actually for our post. We're going to say this just equals response.data. And actually, just to make this easier, I'll go ahead and replace this with post. I'm going to put this declaration above this one. And for right now, just to get this out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and delete this stuff right here. So now, what have we actually done so far? Well, this const response equals await axios.get line here is just retrieving our post from Mongo like normal by getting its ID. And then what we're doing is setting a variable post equal to the data that is returned from that request. And then what we're doing is we are calling the get image function we made a second ago to actually get the image from AWS. The last thing we should do is actually append the image itself to this post before we return it back to the front end. We can do that really simply by just saying post.image equals, and we're going to say data. And then lastly, we just need to return the post to the front end. So we're going to say return post. Not sure why I wrote it like that. Let's go ahead and return post just like this. Now that we have these two things done, we're ready to implement these functions in our React code. So let's go ahead and save this file. And let's first deal with the React logic that we need to upload an image to AWS. The only spot right now in our code where that would make sense is the page where we are creating a post. So let's actually close out of some of these files here just to free up this top bar. And we're going to clear out this create user as well. And we're going to go to the create blog page. On this page, we already have most of the functionality already written to handle uploading a post to Mongo. All that we actually need to add is functionality to upload an image as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and make another field in our object here. And that field is actually going to be file, because if you remember in our API here, we specified that we're going to expect a post.file. So we're going to make sure that there is a file field right here. Let's go ahead and make a piece of React state for this file. So I'm going to go up here. I'm going to say const file, set file. And for right now, that will just be empty. And whenever we submit our object here, let's just submit that as file. Let's actually now add a field in our JSX to capture this file object. So we'll go down here to the bottom, and let's go right below this text area where we're getting content. I'm going to go ahead and add another label, and I'm going to say insert header image. And then all we need to do is make another input tag here. And the easiest way that I found to go ahead and get file input is just to specify a type equals file when you're getting an input tag like this. And I can actually show you this real quick if I go ahead and save this file and I go over here. Let's just separate these tabs out. Let's get this a little readjusted here. And you'll see, even though it's not formatted very well, we have this insert header image, choose file. And if I go ahead and click this, it'll open up my file explorer. If we want to set this file state to whatever we're uploading in this choose file right here, what we can do is just add an onChange property. And whenever we do this, we're going to call a function. I'm just going to call it handle file upload. And we're going to give this a required as well so that we can't submit our form without submitting some sort of image. Let's now actually go up here and define that function. So we're going to go up here and we're going to say function handle file upload. First things first, let's get the file out of the event object that is triggered whenever we do this onChange event. So we'll add an E here. Oops, not export, just E for event. And then we're going to get the file. We're going to say const file equals, and then we're going to do e.target.files. And this line right here is how you always extract a file from an input field like this one here. Before we set our file state as being equal to this file, we should check a couple of things. First things first, we should check to make sure this file is actually an image and not something else like an audio file. If we allow the user to upload anything like we're theoretically doing right here, and we want to actually display the image, let's say they've actually uploaded like a video or something, that's going to cause problems when you try to render it in our React. So we need to check for that to make sure that it is an image. Second, we should probably put a size limit on the file so users don't try and upload a like 10 gigabyte file or something and eat up all of our storage. So first, let's make sure the file is some type of an image. We can go about this in a couple of different ways, but we'll figure this out by looking at the name of the extension. If it ends in .jpg or .png, then for right now, we'll say it's valid. I know there are more image types out there, but we'll just support JPEG and PNG for right now. Next, we can easily grab the extension of a file. The typical method for this is to use the substring and last index of method. Here's how we do it. We'll make a new variable, let's just say const file extension, and set it equal to the name of the file, which is just stored in file.name. Next, we can call the .substring method, which can be used to divide the string into smaller parts. Inside of here, let's access file.name again. And then we can call the last index of method, and then we're going to pass in the string of a period for the argument. What this chunk does right here is it basically selects every index and beyond where we see whatever this character is. So if let's say I upload a file that is just myimage.png, what this line will do is extract just the PNG from there so that PNG will be stored in this file extension variable. Now let's go ahead and check. We're going to write an if statement down here, and we're going to say if file extension is not equal to .jpg or file extension is not equal to .png, then we want to do something. If this block runs, we should tell the user this file isn't in the correct format. So I'm going to go ahead and alert. I'm going to say files must be JPG or PNG. And actually, since we're allowing JPEG, let's also include that as well. I know we have JPG here, but we can also have JP where we have JPEG. So let's do that too. Let's take this line, copy it. I'm going to do or paste this here. And I'm going to add the E in JPEG just so we cover 3 file types instead of just 2. Now, one thing we should be aware of is that this handle file upload is not the actual function that is called when we're submitting our object to our backend. It is merely going to set the state. So what we should do is if this is wrong, in addition to alerting the user that it is wrong, we should also wipe out this input field so they still aren't allowed to upload it to Mongo and AWS. If we want to directly modify the JSX content, but actually in JavaScript, we can use something called the useRef hook from React. So I'm going to go ahead and import useRef just like this. And then let's make a reference. I'm going to say const, I'm going to call this input file equals useRef, and we'll make the original ref equal to null. And then we're going to go down here to our input field here, and we're going to just put a ref here. And for ref, we just named it input file. Now that we have this ref embedded in this input, we can modify this input however we want, which now will allow us to wipe out the input if the image is of the wrong type. To wipe it out is actually pretty simple. We'll just need to reference the ref that we just made, input file.current, because that's how React stores its current refs. And then we'll say .value equals, let's just set it to an empty string. And then we want to make sure we retain the type as well so it stays as a file type. So we'll say current.type equals file. And now let's go ahead and actually test this. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to go into my file explorer here, and I'm going to choose a file that is not an image file. I'm going to select the CSV here. Go ahead and do that. It'll say files must be JPEG or PNG, and you'll see it still says no file chosen right here. However, if I go and reopen it, and I go into somewhere down here, and I find an actual, let's say an image here, I can go ahead and open this, and it's actually still telling me there's an error. So let's go ahead and open up our console here and do some quick debugging. Let's go console, and let's see. I think these may be errors from earlier. Let's go ahead and wipe these out here. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. Let's make sure we're not getting any errors when we try and do the file upload. And actually, I'm just going to go ahead and console log out file so that we can see what the file looks like when we upload it. So save that. Let's go ahead and go into our console here. Let's go to the upload, and let's just select a random image right here. And you can see it says this is the file right here. And we can see the name here does end in .jpeg. So let's actually check to make sure that file extension is pulling properly. I'm going to go ahead and print off file extension as well. Save this, refresh the page here. And I'm going to go ahead and retry this. I'm going to use the same thing here. And it says it is .jpeg. You know what? I think I messed up the logic. This should not be ors. These should be ands. we should be checking to make sure they're not any of these, not a single one. Make sure these are ands here. Let's save this, wipe this out, and let's actually go ahead and try this again. So we'll choose this file right here. We'll do this, and you'll see now we have this file selected. However, let's try going for an invalid file now. Let's go here. I'm going to go ahead and select a CSV file, and it'll say files must be JPEG or PNG, and now it'll say no file chosen because it wiped it out. So that's exactly the behavior that we want. Let's now handle the rest of this function here. So right here, we have this if statement like we just checked to make sure it is of the right file type. I'm going to go ahead and delete these console logs here just to free up some space. And then let's go down here. Actually, in this if it hits this, I don't want to keep going in this function. I actually want to stop its functionality. So I'm going to go ahead and return. However, assuming we get past that, that means that the file is valid. So let's go ahead and actually set the file state to whatever our file is. But wait, let's actually check one more thing. Let's check the file size to make sure it's not too big. I'm actually going to go up to the top of our component here. I'm going to make a new variable, a constant. I'm just going to say const, I'll call it max file size. And let's set it equal to something. For now, I want to limit the image to 15 megabytes. So I'm going to say 15,000,000. This is because file size is measured in bytes, not megabytes. And 15 megabytes is just 15 million bytes. Then let's go ahead and scroll back down to this file upload here. And then I'm going to go ahead and say if file.size exceeds max file size, then what do we want to do? Well, let's do the same thing kind of like we're doing up here. Let's alert and let's say file size exceeds the limit. And I'll say 15 megabytes. And let's do the same thing. We're going to wipe out that file so the user can't work with that file anymore. So we'll just add this code in here. This first check, again, is just checking if the file extension is of the proper type to make sure it's an image. And the second one is checking the file size to make sure it's not too large. If we've made it past these two things and we've gotten to this line of code, that would mean that we are safe and we are ready to go. So we can go ahead and set the file to the file that was uploaded. Now let's actually go ahead and save this file. And I want to run some testing so we can do some debugging as needed. So with that being said, let's go ahead and fill out some of these fields here. I'm going to go ahead and enter just some random letters for these just so we can get them filled out quickly. I'm going to go ahead and open this choose file. And let's just select a random image that I just downloaded and go ahead and press submit. It looks like we got a connection refused, which means our server most likely crashed. I'm going to go ahead and open up our terminal. Let's do some quick debugging. Let's head here into our backend. And it looks like we did in fact have an error here. And it says no values provided for this label here. Okay, so off screen, I did some super quick debugging, and I realized that whenever we change this to the files here, we need to change these fields here. So this should be file.original name, and this one should be file.buffer, because the actual file content itself is stored in buffer, and the name, which we're using as the key here, is just an original name. And when I went ahead and changed that, and I look back at our AWS here, we can see the image that I picked here is actually uploaded here. I can refresh just to make sure. And actually, I'll expand this a little bit so you can see. And you can see that the file is now sitting in here, which happens to be the exact same file that I just uploaded. Let's check Mongo to see if the image ID uploaded successfully with it. So I'm going to go ahead and go to our Mongo here. Let's refresh our post. And let's go ahead and take a look at it. So we can see here, it looks like we have our post, but our image ID is set to null. I just did some quick checking. And because we are actually hosting our item using the name of the file, instead of doing data.data.version ID, what we can actually do is just say post.file.name, and this will capture the image ID properly. Now that we've made this change, let's go ahead and save this file. Let's go ahead and test this out again. Let's go into Mongo. I'm going to change these around a little bit. I'm just going to do some random letters here. Same file we're going to upload. I'm going to go ahead and press submit, and let's see what happens. Looks like we had no errors so far. So let's go ahead and check Mongo and see if the post uploaded correctly. Go ahead and scroll down here, and we can actually see here on this image ID, we now have the image that we just uploaded, which you will notice if we go ahead and zoom in here a little bit so you can hopefully see a little better. This highlighted name right here of the image file matches exactly the name of this file in AWS, and that's how we're going to be able to retrieve the items or retrieve the images when we need to. Now that we have all those errors ironed out, we can go ahead and move on to the last part of the video where we'll actually pull an image from AWS and display it on our page. When it comes to loading an image, the only place right now on our site that we'll need to do that should be on the read blog page, because that's where we're actually displaying the images for that particular blog post. We already have pretty much all the functionality needed to get the information for a post. We just need to add the image now. The first thing we'll want to do is go ahead and import the get image that we just made in the API file. And just so we know when we're doing the right thing, let's go ahead and go here and let's go to the post that we have uploaded. And the only thing we should actually need in this file to make this work is to go ahead and add an image tag down here. So let's have it so where we do our title and description, and then we'll do our image and then our date. So we'll insert our image here, and let's just give it a source of, I believe it should be just post.image. Let's go ahead and save this. And it looks like we have just an image here that is blank. Just for the sake of debugging, let me real quick go up here. And before we set our React state, I'm actually going to console log out this data just so we can see if I'm accessing the right field, because I may not be. So if you go in here, it is in the image field. Okay, sorry. So it should not be .image, it should be .image.data. So let's go ahead and do .image.data, save it, and you can see now our image displays on our page. It's rather huge, but it is displaying. Now that we know the image uploading and fetching is good to go, we'll officially wrap up this video on media management. In this episode, you'll learn how to use a cloud service like AWS S3 to store images for your website, how to connect that functionality to Mongo through your app, and how to pull these images and render them in your React app. In the next video, we'll focus extensively on styling the website with CSS to make it look professional. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.